I think we have a critical mass, so I might as well go ahead and get started so that we can maximize time. I don't know exactly how this is going to pan out. We're just going to live demonstrate creating some modular music. But first, I've got a little bit of a tutorial. Because I'm going to be sharing my screen and stuff, I'm not really going to see the chat. So just unmute yourself and blurt something out. That way, I don't miss anything. So don't be shy about that. Yeah. So thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so this is generative music. So first of all, what is generative music? So the term generative music is attributed, as far as I can tell, to Brian Eno, who's a producer and composer, and as, quote, music that is ever different and changing and is created by a system. So it has roots in aleatoric music, which alia is Latin for dice, and also it has roots in musique concrète, which was as music recording technology became a thing, then composers started figuring out how to incorporate tape loops and things like that into their compositions. So in other words, it's like combining looping and chance, elements of randomness and repetition, plus other constraints like a musical scale, for example, to create a musical system that can generate music. And it can either be something where you set it up and you push play and go away, or it could be a thing where you can interact with it in various different ways and change the parameters, but you're not in total control over it. These ideas kind of took hold in West Coast modular synthesis, which evolved out of the Tape Music Center in San Francisco in the 1960s. And so they embraced these notions of looping, synthesizer sequencers. I might be getting my history wrong, but I think sequencers came out of West Coast synthesis as opposed to East Coast synthesis, which focused more on, not to get too much into the particulars, but in terms of the human interface. East Coast philosophy was more about like creating familiar instruments using keyboards and familiar interfaces for making music, whereas West Coast was like, let's throw all that out the window and come up with new things. And looping sequencers were one of those, as well as randomized control voltage for chance, and then like other interfaces like knobs and pressure plates and things like that instead of keyboards. So my journey into generative music making and modular synthesis, they're kind of the parallel tracks for me. So I was in a band called Delicious Pastries until 2019 when we played our last show. Then the whole world shut down because of a little thing called coronavirus in 2020. And so I was stuck at home with extra time on my hands and nobody to get together and play music with. And I started watching YouTube videos about lots of things, but among other things, modular synthesizers, and then became smitten with this idea of adapting synth modules as virtual bandmates to like bounce ideas around. So for me, it came out of this idea of like, I had developed my well-worn ruts. You pick up a guitar and you've got that muscle memory for the cowboy chords. I wanted to break out of those ruts, and this seemed like a way to do it. I also was sick of staring at computer screens because A, my work was in tech, and B, I was now stuck at home and all of my meetings were through screens. So that's why I also chose to go this route of hardware modular synthesizers where I could tweak knobs and push buttons and not necessarily have to look at a screen. If you'll indulge me for just a minute, I'll show some examples from 1590 and FAWM where I started incorporating these. So in this first piece, it's kind of an illustration of how I combined it with more traditional deterministic program sequences and guitar. Shoot. I was trying to jump ahead here. So all the melodies you're hearing at this point are, I'm programming the drums, obviously, but everything else was done entirely generatively based on some constraints that had to do with how all those wires are plugged up. another pseudo-generative aspect is the drum sequencer.
Hey, Bert, it's a bit hard to hear your voice over the music.
Sorry.
No, I think, yeah, if you just lower the music a little bit, might.
Well, that's probably, we don't need to play this all the way to the end. Hopefully that gave you an idea. What I was trying to say was the opening little descant piece was entirely generated by the generative system. And then I also twiddled some knobs on the BeatStep Pro sequencer. Even though I programmed in the drum part, which I did live, and you saw me do that, as I was turning those knobs up halfway through the piece, that introduced some randomness and chance so that it started shuffling things up. And by the end of the piece, the drums were more erratic and maybe had more energy. So I'll switch over to this other piece, and I won't play the whole thing here either, but this was actually the first thing I did for Fawm this year. As you can see, in the 2 years between when I started diving into it, I went a little nuts and started over collecting modules and putting them together. But this was the 10 by 10 challenge, where I had one system completely on its own generate 10 different compositions, and every, I think, 4 or 8 bars or something, it would resample some random voltage, which reset the whole system and then created a whole new thing. So even though the video is edited, like it looks like I'm splicing together a bunch of different takes, it's all live. It's all one take. So I'll stop there. Something that I've done in the last year, like starting with this Fawm and also through 1590, is incorporating some of these generative techniques into more like conventional songwriting, basically using the generative techniques to create some assets, some loops or something, which then I'll bring into the DAW and then further manipulate and try to write other parts around it. So it's become part of a toolbox, not necessarily it's not just robot music. So my starting points for songwriting, at least, I think of it in 5 categories. So there's rhythm, melody, harmony, which you can either think as counterpoint for the melody or like chord progressions, sound design, and lyrics. So whenever I write a song, I usually start with 1 or 2 of these things and then try to build it around from there. So I'll sit down with a guitar, come up with a chord progression and a rhythm for it, or I'll come up with a melody line and then figure out words for it and then backfit like a chord progression, something like that. For the purposes of this little workshop, we're not focused on lyrics. And even though modular synthesis has a lot to do with sound design, we're actually not going to focus on that either. We're going to kind of focus on rhythm, melody, and harmony. And we're going to use free software, which is VCV Rack. So one of the reasons it took me so long to get into modular synthesizers, even though I had friends who were into it, 2 reasons. One is I had so little time to make music that whenever I wanted to do it, I wanted to sit down and just do it. Like I didn't want to have to plug in patch cables. I didn't want to have to tweak knobs. I just wanted to get down to making music and pick up something familiar, give me a preset. And the other reason is it's pretty expensive. So each one of these modules, and you need about maybe a dozen or so just to get started. Each one of those is like the price of a boutique guitar pedal. So it's kind of an investment. But VCV Rack is a virtual modular synth environment, which is free and open source. There is a pro version that's also available as a DAW plugin. So you can still, what I have done is run it as standalone software, which is what we're going to do today. and you can still sync it with your DAW. You can run MIDI clock from GarageBand or Logic or Cubase or Reaper or Ableton or whatever you use, and then use the modules that we're going to be talking about today for sequencing, and then route the notes and MIDI events back into your DAW. We're not going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how to do that today because we're just going to stay within VCV Rack, but it is a thing that I've done and it's pretty cool. So some of the key ingredients, the core modules you need, and hopefully even if we don't get very far in the next 40 minutes, this is enough for you to like sink your teeth into and then start playing around for free. There's lots of VCV Rack tutorials and things, but you need rhythm sequencers and modulators, clock dividers, Turing machines, topographical or Euclidean sequencers, and Boolean gates are good examples of this. Some of them are deterministic, some of them are randomized. You need control voltage sequences and modulators, Turing machines, sample and hold, LFOs, envelopes, etc. And we'll go through examples of all these in the next 40 minutes. Control voltage, if you're new to modular synthesis, there's two main types of control voltage. There are gates and triggers, which are for rhythms. It has to do with like timing. And then control voltage can be a continuous voltage, and you can use that for multiple things. One thing you can use it for is to control pitch. Eurorack modular synthesizers uses a 1 volt per octave standard. So for every volt it goes up, then the pitch of your oscillators will go up 1 octave. But you can also use those as kind of invisible magic hands to control other module parameters. And this is modulation. So modular synthesizers full of modules that do modulation. There's a lot of tongue twisting. And then there's other utilities like quantizers, mixers and adders, VCAs or voltage controlled amplifiers, logic modules, and sequential switches. I don't know how many of those we're going to get through today, but those are some of the basic ingredients for doing modular synth-based generative composition. All right, so let's dive in. So this is VCV Rack when it first gets opened up. This is just the default patch. As soon as you download and install VCV Rack, this is how things are wired up. You've got this MIDI to CV module that has, there's basically 3 of these jacks that you need to know about. There's gate, volt per octave, and clock. And what's happening here is as I push a key on the keyboard, that's triggering a gate, which opens up these envelopes. And then the volt per octave goes to these 3 oscillators, which are then all mixed down and controlled by the envelopes to create this monophonic voice. Okay, now I'm going to switch and open up this this is a clean slate patch. We're hopefully not going to get too complicated, but what I have here, I've got 3 melodic voices that we're going to use for like a bass, tenor, and soprano or something. And I've got 3, this is a kick drum, and this is a noise source connected to like some envelope VCA things that will be a hi-hat and kick. So we're going to stick for the next 35 minutes or so just to percussion. Will be 3 elements: kick, snare, and hi-hat. And if we get that far, there will be up to 3 kind of monophonic voices, like a bass, a mid-range, and a high end. Let's see. And then I've got this mixer over here going to the output. So hopefully if everything's wired up, let's start with, let's say, a clock divider. So if I hit play here, hopefully you can see these lights blinking. So it is now getting clock pulse from the MIDI controller out here. What I can do is take this 2-2 and wire it up to the, I think this one's the hi-hat. Maybe not. Okay, that's super fast. Let's go down to here. Okay, can people hear that hi-hat-ish sound all right?
No, we can only hear your voice.
Ah, I know what's going on. Hold on. I need to switch this to Zoom audio device. All right. Did that come through? Okay. So now hit play. We are at 120 beats per minute. Let's all right, let's say that that's our hi-hat. And half of that, if I've got the clock divider set up correctly, let's route that to the kick. Okay. And then every other one of those, let's go to the snare. All right. Pretty straight up techno beats, but this illustrates the uses of a clock divider. Basically, the hi-hat's hitting every note, the kick is every other note, and then the snare is every other note compared to that. And you can keep on going down the line, for example. So that's one way to use a binary clock divider to create rhythms. It doesn't change much, and it gets kind of boring. So something else we can do, when you set up VCV Rack, all these ones at the bottom are the default ones that come with VCV Rack, but lots of players in the modular synth world, some of the brands actually open source their hardware modules, and there are ports and versions of them for free within VCV Rack. The biggest players and the ones that we'll mostly be using today are Mutable Instruments, which is they're actually shutting down business, but all of their things are cloned as Audible Instruments. And so we're going to use one of their things called branches. And what this is, we'll take that hi-hat, which is this red one that goes here, and we'll run it to the input of this, and then run one of the two outputs back into the clock divider. So what this is a randomizer that every time it receives a pulse in, it'll choose which of these two outputs, A or B, to send it to. Right now I'm having it go to A, so I hit play. And we can crank this up, or let's switch it over to B. And if we crank this up, now it's back to. So we can use this to control how many of those notes actually go through to trigger the hi-hat. We can also do this with the kick on the other channel. And now at this point, so that already gets a little more interesting, but maybe it adds a little too much unpredictability. So maybe we want to add another module. This is a module that is what's called a Euclidean sequencer. And so what a Euclidean sequencer does is a specialized kind of clock divider. This particular module, I'm going to turn it to 16, a 16-step loop. And I'm going to I'm going to take as its input clock the same as the hi-hat. And let's see, the number of hits. Right now, it'll do 8 out of 16. Let's turn it to 4 out of 16. Now the kick will be triggered by this. Let's see what this sounds like. So what a Euclidean sequencer does is it tries to distribute the hits as evenly as possible out of the 16 steps. Now, if it's divisible by that number, it's the same thing as using like a straight up clock divider. But if it's a prime number or an odd number or something, then you get these kind of like polyrhythmic feels. And what we can do is now use another utility, like this is basically we're going to combine the two triggers. So we're going to take the output of the Euclidean sequencer, And we're also going to take the output of this randomized thing and run that now into the kick. And so now when either this regular 7 out of 16 beat or the random coin flip of every other hit, if either of those things trigger, then the kick will fire. And so we can use this knob as kind of like a tap. The more we turn it up, the more hits we're going to get, and so on and so forth. We can also do that by turning the hits knob. We can also do a thing like, let's put an LFO in here, a low frequency oscillator. And let's use a sine wave to control a little bit of, actually that's probably too erratic. What we can do is use, we're now using a sine wave to control, it's like invisible hands touching this knob and turning it up and down in time with this LFO. So now, yeah, if we hit play now, hopefully people could like feel that difference. Basically the LFO there's not a visual representation here, but as the LFO was kind of going up, the number of hits was going up and then it was backing back off. And it wasn't even synced with the main rhythm, but to my ears at least, it still felt parsimonious, like something that kind of worked. Okay, moving on. Where do we want to go next? Actually, I'll pause here and ask if anybody's got any questions.
Yeah, I've got a question. Do you ever plug anything in wrong and it howls at you? And is it possible to like if it was an audio circuit or whatever, and you get the thing where you plug in the wrong thing and you get a load of feedback? Is it possible to kind of hook it up wrong so that you get, that it's...
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. So certainly if you're dealing with hardware modules, yes, that can happen. And depending on the module, whether it's analog or digital, like it could fry the module.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Here in the software virtual environment, I don't know if you noticed, like when so this cable, I'm starting it from an output. So I click on that and automatically anything that is also an output goes gray, and
right.
Yeah. So I can't actually hook this up to either of those. I can only hook it up to things that are inputs and can actually accept it. So we've talked about clock dividers. We've talked about Euclidean sequencers and Boolean gates. Maybe let's talk about a topographical sequencer. So one of my favorite mutable instruments modules is a thing called grids. That is one of the few modules that hasn't been ported officially, like over into VCV Rack, but it's open source. Somebody else just made their own, and it's called Topograph. So what this is Emily, who is the software engineer and module designer behind mutable instruments, analyzed lots and lots of MIDI loops and then kind of distilled them all into, you can think of like a 2D map of drum beats. And then a point in that map corresponds to a particular rhythm. And then, so there's this map X and map Y knobs. And as you turn those, so what we'll do is we'll take, I'm going to remove all these triggers for now. And I'm going to take our clock from the clock divider here and set this to run. Oh, let me hit play. Okay, so these LEDs are lighting up. Good. So what this is, channels 1, 2, and 3. Let me make sure I've got this set to original. Okay, 1, 2, and 3 correspond to kick, snare, and hi-hat rhythms. So if we wire this up to the kick, let me turn the speed up a little bit. Okay, and we'll wire this up to the snare. No, that's the hi-hat. And so this is a particular, oh, that's right. Let's just go straight from the clock output. All right, now we're down at 100 beats per minute. So this is a pre-programmed rhythm. And if we move the X and Ys, then that will move us kind of around in that rhythmic space. And these knobs are kind of like taps, sort of like earlier when we were turning this up and down to get more or less kick. The same thing happens here. So if we want like no hi-hat, then we can turn that down, and we want more snare. And again, we can use an LFO to sort of control that. So now let's talk about sample and hold. So that's another way to add kind of unpredictability. I'm going to use this one just because it's a clone of a hardware one that I'm more familiar with. So this very bottom section of this is a sample and hold. And what it has is a noise output. So if I wire this up here, you just hear some noise. But what we can do now is use a trigger. Let's say we'll even use the same trigger to trigger the sample and hold. And now every time there's a kick, it will sample the value of the noise, the voltage of the noise at that particular time, and then hold it until the next trigger. And let's use that to modulate the decay on the kick. And let's turn all the others down so we can just hear the kick for right now. And let's see what happens. Sorry, the snare was still happening because we had this LFO here that was turning the knob up. So you could hear like the decay on the kick was like it was getting longer and shorter. We can also modulate the shape of it. And that's kind of like totally random from this sample and hold. We can add another sample and hold module right next to it. Let's move some of these around. And let's even trigger from the same thing. And that output will go to the tune. So now every single kick hit will have slightly more or less distortion and be slightly higher or lower in pitch. Okay, now another thing that we can do, let's get another clock divider going. And now what we're going to do, This is some deep dive stuff. Accent clock reset. Okay, so this bottom row, this output is like a rhythmic accent. It's like, well, you can wire it up to add more punch to the notes. We're not going to do that. Then the middle one becomes the clock, and the output becomes the reset. So I'm going to wire up the clock to this clock, and now this clock is 1/24th of the system clock, so that everything's in sync. That was kind of a technical detail, but anyway. So now what we're going to do is let's set this to binary mode. So now hold on. No, what I'm going to do is reset. So every 16 beats. So the drum loops that are programmed in here are 16-step sequences. So now every 16 beats, it's going to send a clock pulse over here. And what I'm going to do is now every other one of those, I'm going to trigger a sample and hold. And the outputs of these, instead of modulating the kick, I'm now going to modulate the X and Y parameters. So now when I hit play, what's going to happen is that it's going to play a drum sequence. Yeah, I've got everything wired up. So every 2 bars, once every bar, this module is going to send an output to the clock divider. And then every other bar, it's going to trigger this sample and hold and sample new voltages, which will turn these knobs virtually. And basically every 2 bars, we're going to get a totally different rhythm. Right. So hopefully you could hear that, like it was kind of consistent for a little bit, and then these sampled totally new values, which kind of virtually turned those knobs to an entirely different location. You could have a bunch more sample and holds, modulate the fill parameters so that each time it's also more or less kick or whatever.
Or a quick question for you.
Yep.
How are you documenting this as you go? So if you like sneeze and come back, it still makes sense.
So that is both the blessing and the curse, I think, of modular synthesis. I mean, with VCV Rack and software, like you can save this, and then you just kind of have to trace your wires. In the hardware world, it's kind of like you work on a patch, and then it really needs to be in the moment, because you're going to record it and document it and rip all the patches up, and that's it. And I kind of like that about it. But to answer your question, I think there's no like super easy way. There's a lot of wire tracing.
Not like a modeling language for this or anything like that. Okay.
I mean,
cool.
there might be, not that I'm familiar with.
Okay. Cool.
All right, so let's move on to Turing machines, because that opens up a whole new can of worms. So this is not a Turing machine in the classical computer science sense. What this is a looping randomized control voltage sequencer, and the VCV Rack module comes built in with 2 of the hardware expansions. So one is called the volts expansion, which is this row of knobs to the right, and the other one is called the pulses expansion, which are all these trigger things on the left. So I'm gonna undo just all of this up here for now, and we're just gonna focus on the Turing machine. So what we'll do, actually, to keep everything in sync for the future, I'm gonna use the clock that's coming out of Topograph, and that comes into the clock of the Turing machine. So let me move this down here so that it's a little less cluttery. Hopefully that's less cluttery. So if we hit play now, Oh, wait, things are still hooked up to the drums. All right. So, oh, wait, we want that. So now the clock is coming out and you see all of these like blinky lights. What's happening here, this is kind of like a sample and hold, where every time it gets a clock input, it is deciding you can have it anywhere from 2 up to 16 steps. It is sampling a new voltage, and that's coming out here on the output. So now I'm going to move this up here because let's use the melodic bass line here. So this one is a trigger output, and this out right here will be a control voltage, which I'm going to put in. This is an octave shift. So what this is doing is lowering the pitch by however many, I guess 4 octaves to make this more of a bass note. Now I'm going to take the output of this, plug it into the mixer, and let's see what happens. All right, that was interesting. That's because this was happening so fast. How my math is wrong. How do I want to slow this down? Well, I guess let's do that. Oh, nope, that's doing nothing. We want there we go. Okay, so right now it's just like using a sample and hold where it totally is random melodies coming out. But what the Turing machine can do is there's this knob, and as you turn it to the right, so now it's captured a 16-step random loop. We can drop it down to 4 steps. Set it to however many steps we want, and that's how much it will loop. And we can also and if we turn it all the way to the left, it'll do the same thing, except it loops it both forward and backward, thus doubling the length of the loop. So let's move this to 8 steps. So it's doubling the loop, but playing it forwards and then backwards. There's also the scale to control how big of a jump it makes. So that it's not going, like it's not spanning 8 octaves or something. You can kind of like tamp it down. However, well, let's talk about the expanders. The volts will do something similar. Under the hood, it does it in a slightly different way. But what we can do is hook this output up to the volt per octave of this other voice. And we can use, let's see, the 4 trigger instead of the 1 trigger to trigger that voice. And so the primary output, you don't have much control over how this is going to get a little bit technical here, but what's happening under the hood, there's 8 little LEDs here. And what's happening is that there's a shift register underneath the hood, and there's basically 8 different values here that get summed together to create the output voltage. What this expander does is it takes, instead of all 8 values and summing them up, it takes just the first 5 of those values and lets you control how much of each one of the values gets mixed with the others. And so it'll create a totally different output voltage that is still somehow rhythmically and related to the first one. So let's hit play and see what happens now. Oh, I need to actually hook it up to the mixer. Let's turn that up. So each of these outputs corresponds to the one is, yeah, it's hard to explain. And since we're running on short on time, I'm not sure exactly how to explain technically what's happening here, but you've got, this is kind of a like what's called a ripple counter. So each clock that comes in, there may or may not be a trigger on the output one here. But regardless of whether or not there is, exactly one beat later, the 2 will trigger, and exactly one after that, the 3 will. And so if you were paying attention to the LEDs, whenever the 1 goes high, then that light just kind of moves down the scale. Right. If I slow it down, you can maybe see it more easily. So basically what happens is the higher voice is being triggered exactly 4 beats after the lower one. However, they're totally different notes. And they're also not set to any kind of a scale. So another tool to make this a bit more musical is a quantizer. So let's add 2 quantizers here. And now the output voltage of this one, I'm going to put into this quantizer, and then the output goes into, the bass octave controller. And this volt per octave will now go into the other quantizer. And they're on the same scale, I think, with no offsets. So let's see if this sounds more musical. So by some definitions of more musical, it sounds more musical, but particularly the higher voice is all over the place because there's a higher range. So if we lower all these knobs, that'll restrict the range it can jump, and it'll stay within an octave or 2. And then what we can also do is the trigger of that. Well, we can decrease the frequency by, this one will only trigger whenever 4 and 7 go off. So it'll go about half as often. And now this knob, if we set it straight up the middle, that goes back to totally random in terms of the volt. Yeah, in terms of everything. But as we turn it up, it becomes more it loops more. So basically it's like a knob you can turn of, this is more loopy, this is more random, this is also more loopy, but it will double it going backward and forward. But the closer it gets to the middle, with each beat or each hit, the more likely it is it'll just do something kind of like random and erratic. There's only 2 minutes left, so I think I'll stop here. I think that covers a lot of the basics. We didn't get to logic modules or sequential switches or VCAs and how they can also be used to add more kind of character and depth. And we also didn't talk about how to take VCV Rack and then hook it back up to a DAW so that you can sample it in MIDI and then have this run your own favorite virtual instruments. But all of those things are possible. Hopefully this was a good crash course. And if there's any questions in the last 60 seconds, I'll take them.
Briefly, it feels like a wealth of toys at your disposal, especially with VST stuff.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting for me as someone who's primarily was a punk rock guitar player, bass, drums, and guitar, and a guitar is a polyphonic instrument. I never until I started getting into modular synthesis, where each voice is primarily monophonic. I never really thought about counterpoint and harmony in that way until the last couple of years, and then creating these generative systems to produce. So, for example, something we didn't get around to doing yet, this topographical drum sequencer here is designed to be a drum sequencer, kick, hi-hat, and snare, but there's nothing stopping you from having that rhythmically trigger like bass, alto, and treble voices. And then you can always have one underlying sequence that's controlling all of them. But then use voltage modifiers, VCAs or whatever, to raise the alto to always be a fifth above the root. And even if you get two voices, let's say you've got a kick, they're triggered by kick and snare. One is always the kind of the root note of the sequence, and the other one is always a fifth up, and then they're both quantized to be the same scale, and then you end up with these interesting counterpoints. So okay, yeah, we're over, and we need to go to the next session. But thanks everybody. Yeah, hopefully this was a fun intro to generative modular synthesis for everybody. Happy filming.
Thanks, Burr.
Thank you, Burr. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.